Hi folks, and welcome back to Innovation and IP. This is the video series on licensing, and this is part one of the video series. Part one is all about negotiation approaches and preliminary stuff. So without further ado, let's jump into our Prezi and we can have a little bit of an overview of today's proceedings. Well, it was all the way back in 2007 when I first got interested in collaborative R&D and innovation, and particularly at that point we were looking at the then newly emerging area of collaborative e-research. E-research, put an E in front of anything, it sounds snazzy. And we were quite interested in the role that IP played in hampering collaborative R&D. At that point, the Megauchi review had come out in 2004, and it was one of the early reviews that showed that negotiations around IP really did cause quite a sticking point in getting collaborative R&D off the ground. So we did quite a large project on that. I ran a survey and we asked participants in collaborative R&D, both in the research sector and in the industry sector, you know, what were the kinds of problems that they often encountered with getting collaborative R&D off the ground. And no surprise really there, IP did crop up as a particularly nasty problem. Really did protract negotiations, unfortunately, for the parties. And 1 in 3 of the parties that we surveyed had actually walked away from a perfectly good licensing arrangement. So that was the big conclusion from that survey. What were the factors that fed into the problem around negotiations and IP? One of the issues that cropped up was persons and personalities. That is, dealing with a multitude of people, and some of them were in for the duration of the negotiation, some were not. A bit of a revolving door, particularly with universities, and personalities. So difficult personalities were an issue. How do you rectify that? You take a good hard look at the way that you conduct your negotiations. Typically, an ordinary IP licensing negotiation will be very tightly focused on preparation of a terms sheet. And the parties will come to the table with this big long shopping list of what they want. And it pretty much gets down to the tin tacks in terms of horse trading and just, you know, negotiating over the parties' positions on various issues that will be ultimately captured in the licensing agreement, rather than sitting down and working out whether the parties really are compatible for a longer-term licensing deal in the first place. Often these deals get concluded quite quickly, and that's a problem in itself, because then usually the parties just dump their term sheet onto the lawyer's lap, and the lawyer has to kind of sort everything out, try and draft up the contract, and then the contract plays ping pong between the parties. The other side gets lawyers involved, and then it's tit for tat in terms of, you know, I want this amendment to that clause and I want this amendment to that clause, and it can take quite some time. One of the factors was time, actually, in parties walking away from licensing deals. Again, this tends to be protracted with universities. The researcher will often approach, or industry will approach the researcher, or vice versa, and they'll get to talking, and they will actually have a fairly good personable relationship. But then, unfortunately, when the deal needs to get done, it gets escalated up the university hierarchy, and you'll have the researchers' line management coming onto the scene. You'll have the university tech transfer office coming onto the scene, and everyone seems to have a different view about how the arrangement should be proceeding and how it should be documented. So that kind of very terms-focused traditional negotiation can be quite a barrier to getting your licensing arrangement off the ground. The major emerging antidote, I guess you'd call it, to all of that is the notion of relational contracting. And relational contracting was fathered by what I call the two Big Macs, Stuart Macaulay and Ian McNeill. We'll talk about those in today's video, and we'll talk about the relational contracting approach that has then been developed from Macaulay and McNeill's work to be applied to longer-term, more complex, multi-party, IP-rich agreements. Then, to round out today's proceedings, we will have a little look at the negotiation tools, term sheets, MOUs, and confidentiality agreements. So that's the run sheet for today. Let's get cracking. Okay, so the first thing to do is look at the Big Macs of relational contracting, Macaulay and McNeill. Stuart Macaulay was, and still is, I believe, 90-odd years old, a law professor, American law professor, and his study in 1963 really was a watershed of legal research for the day, particularly in contract law. Shocked a lot of the law profession at the time, still shocks some nowadays. And what did the study involve? Well, firstly, it involved collection of primary data and analysis of surveys and interviews, which, that was pretty much unknown in those times. Legal research was very much doctrinal. It still is quite doctrinal, although nowadays we certainly have a bit more in the way of socio-legal research that does this kind of stuff. But Macaulay had 68 interviews, as you can see there, with Wisconsin business folks. He exchanged 125 letters with various different people. He sent out more letters of requesting information, but he got 125 back that he could analyse. A fair swag of the participants were manufacturers, so from industry. And this was business to business exchange that Macaulay was interested in. So salespeople with purchasing entities, suppliers, so dealings along the supply chain he was interested in. He had a look at quite a number of standard form contracts that were used between these business folks, and wow, what he found was quite surprising to any trained lawyer, I guess, particularly to law students, because, contract law during law school is really kind of placed on a bit of a pedestal, and you tend to, I guess, finish contract law with this idea that, contracting is a must for every business person, and you have to plan your contract meticulously, and you have to be careful of all of this case law and legislation. And Macaulay's findings said that business people basically took time and were reasonably careful with describing what it was out of the deal, describing the performance required by the other party and exactly what they were going to be getting. Often, as I said, using standard forms. But very few of these business people actually planned for contingencies, as our law training would tell us to do, and even fewer planned for legal sanctions upon the occurrence of contingencies. And quite hilariously, he uncovered that the battle of the forms was rife along the supply chain in Wisconsin. So you'd have suppliers and purchasers dealing with orders and order forms that were completely inconsistent. One party would place an order with all of their standard terms on the back. The party supplying would then supply and provide all of their standard terms. Often there was quite a lot of inconsistency between all of that. No one really seemed to care about the lack of consistency in their dealings, or in fact whether or not any of their terms and conditions were legally binding. And you'd think, well, this could really lead to merry mayhem. Actually, Macaulay found, surprisingly, not. There were very few that resorted to threatening the other party with contract terms when disputes arose, and there were even fewer that actually took their disputes to court. Mostly the disputes got settled, and so Macaulay boldly concluded that in most situations contract is not needed. Wow, I've got a surprised hypothetical law professor there in the photo for you. That is part one of the findings. In part two, we see that Macaulay didn't end it all there, and he actually found that the thing that drove the parties to fix up their disputes, patch up their relationships, or to perform very well as contractually would have been required, was relational factors. Okay, that was a major governing force in the business people's conduct. What were the relational factors that Macaulay took a look at? He found consistently amongst the responses that he got from his participants that there were two important relational norms, we would call them. First, norms are just like social rules. First one was commitments are to be honoured in almost all situations, and the second one was one should produce a good product and stand behind it. I would hazard a guess that those relational norms, even though a lot of time has gone by, jeepers, probably, well, a lot more than 50 years has gone by, I would hazard a guess that those kinds of norms are still very prevalent amongst the business community, certainly amongst the the manufacturing community. Apart from that, there was a whole stack of socially related factors that kept people in line and doing what they should be doing. Salespeople were worried about angry customers, ringing them up and complaining about poor products or poor service. So they'd provide good service and good products. Production people would get leaned on by the salespeople if they weren't doing their job and producing shoddy work. For production people, there's always the threat of being fired if you muck up too often. Macaulay also found there was quite a strong set of social bonds between the business people in this community. So salespeople would buy gifts for their big customers. Often the CEOs and the C-suite of larger companies, the CEOs of the supplier would mingle with the CEOs of the purchasing entity. They would sit on boards together. They would have recreational time together. All of these social factors knit people together in ways that then made the contract pretty much redundant. However, Macaulay found that contracts were important where the potential for risk and injury was high and exchanges were more complex. So in those kinds of situations, you're going to have a bit more recourse to the written terms of the deal, as well as this relational bond that ensures together that performance occurs as it should. In the end, Macaulay says this is great, but these findings really are just scratching the surface of this whole socio-legal area of contracts. He said what we really need is far more research on understanding the functions of the whole system of conducting exchanges. Now that he had uncovered, I guess, the tip of the iceberg, he wanted to explore the rest. How deep did this whole relational issue go, and where was the balance in terms of contractual regulation of conduct and relational regulation of conduct? And that is then where Ian McNeill comes in. Ian McNeill followed, there he is, Ian McNeill, passed away in 2010, sadly. And McNeill's principal contribution is the relational continuum of contracts. And I have borrowed Christensen's depiction of McNeill's continuum there on this slide. And what you can see there, if you look at the diagram, is a continuum, funnily enough, and you have transactional exchanges at one end and relational exchanges at the other end. And what McNeill posited was that all contracts sit in this grand bed of social relations. You can't get away from social relations, no matter how simple your contract is. And generally speaking, the way that you contract will be governed by social norms. There was a stack of social norms that McNeill identified. You can see them there, 1 through 10. And he said the kind of norms that are present in any given contract will really depend on how discrete or transactional they are. That is, are they up the left-hand end of the continuum, or are they up the right-hand end of the continuum? The ones that are on the left-hand side will have far fewer of these relational norms. The ones that are on the right-hand side will have, obviously, more of the social norms governing the parties' conduct during the exchange. So, if you look at transactional contracting, this is the one that's on the left-hand discrete end of the continuum. These are contracts that are market-regulated contracts. So, generally speaking, you'll be looking at buying or selling whatever is freely available on the market. There'll be a competitively determined market price for whatever it is that you're going to be getting or selling. In these kinds of contracts, you will have clear demarcations of obligation and performance, and you will have a sharp in, sharp out attitude of the parties. It's a one-off transactional relationship. There's no real social bond. There might be a few social norms, but no real social bond between the parties. So if you think of buying petrol at a petrol station, typical example of a transactional exchange. You don't want to be necessarily, if you're in a hurry, as I often are, you don't want to have to go into the service station attendant and make small talk for half an hour and develop some kind of social bond, determine that, you know, their petrol is really worth paying for, and then, you know, decide to bargain on the price. That's not what happens at all, is it? It's a sharp in, sharp out, one-off transaction. You'll probably never see that person again. You probably never want to see that person again. Far more efficient that way. However, when you think about it, these contracts are actually embedded in a social matrix, are they not? There is a minimal social relation that governs the parties' conduct, even in just that split second where you get out of your car, you've filled up your car, you go in, and you might not say anything. You might just hold up your credit card. The attendant might say, gas pump number 8, and you might nod, and then they'll ring up the price. You'll put your credit card onto the EFTPOS machine and it'll say approved and you'll walk off. Even that split-second kind of exchange has a minimal social relation attached to it. Even though there's minimal conversation between the parties, there is a common language that is shared. There is an agreement that you're going to be using money to pay for what you've just taken out of the petrol bowser. You're not going to try and offer them to come and wipe up or dry their dishes when they wash up their dishes for a week, are you? It's expected that money will govern the transaction. It also sits in a bed of state-governed rules. So these kinds of things will impel or compel a party buying petrol to actually go in and pay for their petrol rather than robbing the petrol station, because there are state regulated sanctions for robbery and theft. So even very simple contracts like that do have a relational basis, but the type of transaction is very sharp in, sharp out, one-off kind of exchange. A relational exchange, however, is at the very opposite end, and these kinds of contracts, complex, uncertain, often long-term, often, for our particular purposes, IP rich, okay? These kinds of potentially difficult or rocky relationships where there's loads of dynamic factors that might crop up during the party's performance and knock things off the rails. These kinds of contracts really are very heavily dependent upon the relationship between the parties to smooth the way and to cope with all of the uncertainties that might arise during performance. McNeil says that in this kind of exchange, parties will bargain in the shadow of the law. That is, they will bargain in a relational sense, but they know that the law, in terms of the contract that's regulating their behaviour, is sitting there kind of at the ready, casting a bit of a shadow. So both mechanisms, the relations and the contract, have some bearing on the way that the parties conduct themselves. As I said there, McNeil observes that exchanges will punctuate the relation, but they're always deeply embedded in it. Okay, so you'll find the parties have this fairly solid relationship, and then you'll get repeated contractual dealings with each other. So there's the two aspects of things. Think of construction contracts, long-term construction contracts, particularly things like large-scale infrastructure projects, strategic alliances. This is the kind of contract that we're thinking of here. Interestingly, McNeil defined relational contracting as the process of projecting exchanges into the future. Projecting exchanges into the future. This kind of harks back to Macaulay's findings, doesn't it, really? It's the prospect of future dealings that increases the need for a relational approach. So, as Macaulay says, you know, if you want to secure repeat business, if you want to make sure that those exchanges are projected into the future, you've got to have one eye always on the relationship between the parties. I guess you can see where this is all headed for the purposes of our unit. The problem, I guess, that we have had, even though McNeil's work has been very important, the problem has been that the business social science literature has found it quite difficult to apply McNeil's relational norms in terms of getting results when you are trying to assist parties to collaborative R&D. He contributed, didn't he, a stack of, you know, nice sounding norms that increase towards the relational end, but how do you use that knowledge to smooth the way and actually apply it in practice so that you're getting a better result for the collaborating parties? There's just a multitude of studies that have been done to try and operationalize all of these norms and get them into the parties' conduct and contracts. And one of the most successful has been a process that has been developed by some other American law professors and business people. Actually, there's a Friedlinger is a lawyer with a Nordic law firm. So we need to go through Friedlinger et al. And Iden et al.'s work. But I'm going to leave it hanging there for the moment, folks, because it's almost at the half-hour point, and you probably need a break. So I'll skip over to video 2, and until then, bye for now, guys.